Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for today's Business Success Series presented by Manulife. And today we'll be discussing COVID vaccine protocols and safe workplace strategies, a practical guide for employers. My name is Ian McLean, and I'm the President and CEO of the Greater Kitchener-Waterloo Chamber of Commerce. Before we get started, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge that we do live and work on the traditional territory of the Neutral, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee peoples, as we seek a renewed relationship based on a foundation of mutual understanding and respect. As participants in today's virtual event, we are coming together as one. We believe everyone is free to be their true self and receive the same respect and opportunity, regardless of age, ethnicity, gender, culture, identity, sexual orientation, beliefs, or language. We hope you will all join us in fostering a positive environment here today that is a safe and welcoming space for all. We know there's more that we can do, and we are committed to listening, learning, and growing as we go. Today's session would not be possible without the continued support of our sponsors and partners. So a special thank you today to our title sponsor for the Business Success Series, Manulife, our platinum sponsor for the series, our friends at the Immigration Partnership of Waterloo Region, and October sponsor, Dun Troon Law. These organizations and many others are committed to supporting our local economy and providing businesses with the resources and tools they need to thrive. Just before the session starts, I'd like to go over a few quick reminders. Please ensure your mic is muted throughout the presentation so we can reduce any background noise. If you have a tech-related question, please comment in the chat section, and a representative of our team will get back to you momentarily. If you have a question during the discussion today, they'll be gathered throughout the session. I'll take a look for those and we'll do our best to answer any questions as they come up. All attendees will be sent a recording of today's presentation, and it will also be made available on the Greater KW Chamber website. I'd like now to invite Michael Lee, Associate with Dun Troon Law, to introduce his colleagues and today's speakers. Michael.
Thank you, Ian. Dun Troon LLP is proud to be this month's presenting sponsor of the Business Success Series. Today, I have the privilege of introducing today's guests, my fellow colleagues, Jason Beho, Matthew Dewar, and Israel Balter. Jason is an employment lawyer and a founding partner at Dun Troon LLP. Jason has over 20 years of experience as a Toronto employment lawyer. His background includes serving as the managing partner of one of the country's most well-known employment firms, and more than 10 years of practicing employment and labor law at one of Canada's premier service firms. Jason assists clients in all areas of workplace law. His experience in advocating from both the employer and the employee's perspectives, and his unique insight into both of those perspectives enables him to provide more valuable and strategic advice to all of his clients. He also has particular expertise in workplace, occupational health, and safety issues. Matt Dewar is also an employment lawyer and a founding partner at Dun Troon LLP. Matt has over 15 years of experience in practicing employment law. He is widely known across Canada as a master problem solver. His ability to effectively manage and resolve any sort of workplace conflict guides his work with every client, whether he's working with an employer or an employee. He frequently presents on topics such as employer, occupational health and safety duties, avoiding constructive dismissals, human rights, and employment law 101, and is often called upon by various media outlets for his perspectives on employment-related news. He's appeared on Global News, CTV, CBC, and several other news outlets. And finally, Israel Balter is Dun Troon's most senior lawyer. He has over 30 years of experience as an employment and human rights counsel. Israel commands the respect of judges, mediators, tribunal members, and the bar. His profile in the legal community is that of a seasoned and proficient practitioner. Israel is known for his responsiveness to clients. He treats clients as partners in their legal journey. He offers the ability to effectively analyze issues and communicate and implement strategy on behalf of his clients. He also turns around work very fast and efficiently. And my name is Michael Lee. I'm an associate at Dun Troon LLP, and I'm the newest member to the firm. I previously worked at one of the world's largest labor and employment firms representing employers exclusively. Working as an articling student during the pandemic, I've assisted employers and employees in navigating COVID-related workplace issues, and I look forward to answering any questions you may have during today's session. Thanks to all of you for joining today, and I'll now pass it back to Ian.
Well, this is an important session, and I want to thank you for sponsoring this month's, being this month's sponsor for the Business Success Series, but also sharing your thoughts and with us, not only for the group that's watching today on the live stream on Facebook or this webcast, but also for those that will see the link and the podcast after the fact, because it's all important information. Questions that I get and my colleague Greg DeRocher at the Cambridge Chamber get just about every day as we are kind of, I would, fingers crossed, hope that we're getting towards the end of the tunnel or getting towards the light at the end of the tunnel. But because that's where we are, it doesn't mean that some of the issues around COVID won't have long-lasting effects on business. So maybe the place I would like to start, and I'll ask a general question, and maybe each of you can kind of give from your own perch, but maybe a short answer. What's your observation of how this has changed? That COVID has changed the way your companies and your clients and your customers are doing business now, because it's changed in a lot of different ways, on HR, on operations, on supply chains. But maybe just a quick observation to kind of set the stage for, as we look at vaccinations and vax verification and other tools in your business. What are your observations of the pandemic itself? Maybe I'll start with Matthew.
Well, yeah, to say that it's had a change in the way that our employer clients are dealing with things is an understatement. I mean, probably HR issues right off the top, because inevitably you've got, there seems to be one or two anti-vaxxers, if you will, or if they're not hardcore anti-vaxxers, they're vaccine hesitant perhaps, or questioning. And that tends to spin off just one or two employees, even if you've got a workforce of 80 or 100 or 30, is enough to start the wheels spinning in sort of an odd direction. And so what they're dealing with is, what are my responsibilities for those one or two people that are hesitant or anti-vax? What are my responsibilities to the greater good of my workforce? What are my responsibilities to my customers and client base? Are my workers attending on their work site? Are outside clients coming in to my work site? And so the difference is that day to day, it's hard enough, I guess, to manage employees pre-COVID, because there's always some sort of issue. But this is the big thing that I'm finding the most, is how to manage the workplace with everybody concerned, not just maybe a small group, but everybody. That's what I'm seeing for sure.
Jason.
Well, I'm seeing a fresh and really whole new look at the whole concept of nimbleness, agility, responsiveness. I mean, the first few months of COVID, we were all kind of in this holding pattern. And I think that, back in March of 2020, probably a lot of us never would have imagined that here we'd be at month 18 plus, basically, and still grappling with these issues in the way that we are. I remember walking out the door before St. Patrick's Day 2020 thinking, wow, wouldn't it be a kick in the head if we were out for a whole month? And here we are. So, employers have had to embrace not only, challenges from an HR perspective, but how that integrates with their supply chain, with their technologies, with their own service delivery. And it's forced, not only adaptation in terms of work from home, but also how we do things that were previously simple or taken for granted now have to be rethought and re-implemented in a way that is mindful of our occupational health and safety requirements in a way that just wasn't live before. And you've already touched on that. Occupational health and safety is really the touchstone for all of this, and that's where the analysis should begin on so many of these issues. I mean, Matt makes the point that is sort of the attention grabbing point in so much of the discussion on these issues, which is it's about the anti-vaxxers. They're the ones who were making, putting issues in play that then employers feel like, gee whiz, we got to scramble to address this as the priority. The priority is really health and safety, and then the analysis flows down. And yeah, dealing with people who are vaccine hesitant or anti-vax is part of that, but start the analysis at the very top and say this is an occupational health and safety issue, and we've got to design and adapt our business model and our HR practices around it.
Israel.
So I like what Jason was saying, that you start with an overarching principle of occupational health and safety. But Matt made some comment before the program, which I thought was very valid, and that is this, that as business owners, all of you have the right to set the tenor and to establish the rules for your workplace.
Mm-hmm.
Ultimately, you're the boss. We haven't moved to a cooperative model of business just yet in Canada. We still run and own our own businesses. So Jason says occupational health and safety, he's absolutely right. The person who's responsible for occupational health and safety is often the owner or the senior managers, right? But at the same time, who owns the business? Who runs the business? But so you might say, okay, you're the boss, you set the rules. Everybody's got to get vaccinated, right? Sounds easy, but it isn't that easy, because Matt refers to the anti-vaxxers or the vaccine hesitant staff. Now, whether they're right or wrong is immaterial. The problem often arises, and this is something that I throw out to everyone, the staff who are vaccine hesitant often are the people who are the most creative, who think out of the box, who are people you want to keep because they have good relations with other staff. That isn't consistently the case, but that what we're finding is it is often the case. You have an employee who's been with you for 20 years and he won't vaccinate, and you can set the rules. So what are you going to do? Fire him? You're going to affect the major account that he might be running, might take the count somewhere else. So it's easy to talk about baseline issues. You'll set the rules, you'll roll them out, you'll have an education session, and everyone's going to march in lockstep, right? But I don't think it's that easy. And maybe today we'll be able to come up with some solutions, hopefully that are satisfactory, but often it's less than satisfactory.
I think all you have to do is look at Quebec, and they're pushing back their mandate on all healthcare workers being vaccinated by, I think it was Friday, and they pushed it off a month because they can't withstand even the 4% of the healthcare workers that are not vaccinated. So valid point, that easy to say, tougher to do. First thoughts, Michael, and then we'll dig into some detail.
Certainly, I echo everything that all of my fellow colleagues have said, but I genuinely think that just, the general principle that an employer has a duty to take all reasonable steps to protect its employees, to protect the visitors, what that means as a general principle, then how that applies specifically to very specific situations, and also how that applies to, for instance, I think a lot of the issues that we're seeing are people that want to return to work but are hesitant because they want to know, is there a vaccination policy in place? Or, is this remote situation, is this remote work situation going to continue going forward? And, what are our responsibilities and what obligations are there? So I think clarifying that and knowing and clarifying each side's responsibilities has been a large part what we've been responsible for doing.
So let's dig into the vaccine policies itself. I mean, one of the things that I think was happening, it was in theory when they were, I guess it would have been, well, it just seems like forever, but a year ago when they were talking about there may be vaccines in December and January, it was all theoretical. Then suddenly vaccines showed up, and just to discover that not everyone was as eager as I was, and many people were to line up to get their shot. But what I found interesting, and I guess the observation I look to is business in a lot of ways has led government on this. So that once they got it and said, look, if you're not going to mandate through public health, we'll do it in our own businesses. And I guess to your point, Israel and Michael saying, I got a duty to keep all of my staff and my customers. You've got liability and those types of issues. So I guess the question is, in setting the easy to your point, it's easy to say, harder to do. What has been your advice? And I'll maybe start with Jason. What's been your advice in trying to set up what that vaccine policy is? And there's all this talk about exemptions. My understanding, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but the College of Physicians has said there are very, very few exceptions that a doctor should write for, and there's very few religious exemptions, which would be under the Human Rights Code. So it's a small number. Really, it boils down to what's the vaccine policy that you're putting in place, and are you prepared to stick to it when you run into the roadblocks that Israel has highlighted, which are very real. So maybe get us started, Jason.
Sure. Well, I mean, bottom line too is that people by and large want to get back to work. I mean, God knows business wants to get the oars back in the water as quickly as possible, particularly the hard hit sectors like hospitality, restaurant industry. I mean, and these are quite often small businesses where people have put their heart and soul into it. So there is a public policy imperative to get things moving again. And if you dovetail that with the underlying and fundamental occupational health and safety principle that Michael's already spoken to, it is that, and it's black letter law. Every employer in the province has an obligation to take every precaution reasonable in the circumstances. We're well past the point of anybody debating that COVID is a public health issue, a public health hazard, and therefore a workplace hazard. So the obligation under occupational health and safety is, as an employer, we got to take all precautions reasonable in the circumstances to avoid, prevent, reduce the risk of COVID in the workplace. And, you know, another cornerstone of the prevailing wisdom is that the vaccine is effective and it's safe for most people. We all know the dissent that is out there on that, but we have to focus on what is the overall and prevailing wisdom here. And to one of the points that Michael alluded to, whereas we do, and it's only natural that, be it the media, be it employers, be it anybody that's looking at these issues, tends to focus a lot on the people who are beating the drum loudly, saying, what about my rights? I need an exemption. You're trampling on my freedom of choice, et cetera, et cetera. I don't want to say take those issues out of the dialogue, because they're very much part of the dialogue, but you don't want to have the tail wag the dog. One of the points that Michael raised is that you have people that are coming back to work, and by and large, people have embraced the concept of getting vaccinated, and they certainly embrace the concept of coming back to work and getting busy again. So each and every one of those people is in a position to say to their employer, or to at least ask the question, is the company doing enough to protect my health and safety as I return to the workplace? As an employer, if I've got an employee whose job it is, and whose job it has historically been to be at the workplace physically, I get to recall that person. It's not as though the work from home arrangement that has been set up as a stopgap or a triage is something now that the employee gets to say, well, it's been working, so no, you don't get to insist that I come back. The job is here. You come back here as long as we can make a safe environment for you. And the folks who come back and have got concerns that the employer isn't doing enough on that score would be perfectly within their rights to raise the hue and cry to not only the employer, but to the Ministry of Labor and the Occupational Health and Safety branch and say, this employer is not meeting its obligations. So vaccine policies aren't something to be tiptoed around at this stage. I mean, in most cases, an employer that doesn't have some sort of a policy and some sort of a COVID safety plan, and that's something that we'll talk about later, is actually going to be offside of their occupational health and safety obligations, could very well find itself on the receiving end of a complaint by one of their other employees. So, you know, I did say, and this is where we have to break down the macro and address some of the micro, as you know, as Israel averted to, in a in a very real world sense. If we just take a one size fits all, and we basically plow under anybody that doesn't want to get with the program, well, we've done a disservice, because first of all, it's not necessarily true that a mandatory vaccination protocol is appropriate for all employers and all employees. Think about the case, for example, where the workforce is entirely remote. Nobody is face to face with anybody, ever. Think about the lighthouse keeper. I mean, there's not very many of those left anymore, but who is doing his, well, yeah, there's Matt. That's his weekend thing. But think about the person that is sequestered from any other human souls for weeks or months on end. Is it necessary that that person in that workplace is subject to mandatory vax? No.
But let's drill down on that a little bit, because I think this is where we don't go to the edges often enough and say, or to the main meat of this is, there's 85 to 87% of Ontarians that are vaccinated, that are eligible.
Yep.
So the vast majority are vaccinated. I think where the two pieces, and maybe Israel and Matthew can wade in, because we're going to come to the safety plan with Michael in a second. But
yep.
If you've got someone who is vaccine hesitant saying, I don't want to do it, and they don't legitimately have an exemption because they're very limited, you've got, what are the responsibilities to, or do you have to make an accommodation? Number one. And the other is, you've just pointed this out, Jason, if I'm fully vaccinated, you say, I want you to come back to the office. My first question is everyone in the office vaccinated? Because my expectation will be, you're taking my health seriously, and I've done what I've been told by public health. I think this is where small businesses in particular, and you deal with a lot of small business, see Michael nodding his head. It's the small business. Okay for a bank to say mandatory vaccine and we'll work remote, and they have more capacity and more resources. That small business who's going, I only got 8 people, but I wanted to institute this, and someone doesn't want to have it. And then you get into a real, that's a challenge for a small business on how you accommodate someone either way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that one of the points too that you just raised is, it's not just about the person saying, hey, I'm double vaxxed, but I want to come back. I've done my part. Has everybody else done theirs? It's also about the question of, well, yeah, I'm double vaxxed, but I've got an elderly parent that I live with, and I don't want to be taking any extra chances at all. Yep. So yeah, it's this multi-textured, and yeah, I mean, I've done a lot of talking, so let's turn it over to Matt or Israel to talk about some of these exemptions.
Part of having all 4 of you is you're all seeing it from different vantage points. So yeah. Maybe just Matt, what are you hearing from your clients?
Well, you just engage Bill Gates to make sure that those microchips that he's hiding in the vaccine.
That's in the vaccine, yeah.
It's fine. If you can put it in the vaccine, you can put it in a cookie, and it's fine, and then everybody's vaccinated. You used the word accommodation, and I think that that sort of sparked something in my mind to say that there's 2 versions of that. You've got the legal definition of accommodation under the Human Rights Code, and again, you touched upon that about I think there's 1 or maybe 1.5 exemptions medically and religiously speaking. I've yet to hear of anything. But then there's the accommodation in the practical sense of the magic employee, the 1 out of the 10, and you can't afford to lose that one because he or she is otherwise spectacular. And what I've seen is in all of my employer clients, it's a spectrum. You've got certain ones that are, and regardless of size, I hasten to add, because I deal with like 4 or 5 person employers, and I deal with 1,600 and everything in between. And some of the smaller ones are taking a hard line, and I've seen other ones that have gone to extraordinary lengths to accommodate a vaccine hesitant or whatever anti-vaxxer. And so to the extent where they say, okay, 9 out of the 10 have all vaccinated and they're fine. You're making my life difficult, but I'll tell you what, we're going to, you got a mask, you got to submit to a rapid test once, twice, 3 times a week. You know, it's like the proverbial dunce cap. They've got to wear the hazmat suit when they come into the office, and they've got and everybody knows who it is. And I do remember just anecdotally talking to a Quebec lawyer colleague of mine, or friend of mine, I should say, that he said that that's what they are advising employers to do, which is to put a certain amount of social pressure, if you will, or a certain amount of work ostracization risk upon that, where they can't sit in the lunchroom with everybody else. They've got to eat in their desk, at their desk in a closed door, or whatever the case may be. And there's varying degrees of all of that, but that again speaks to the accommodation, not from a legal point of view, but from a practical business point of view.
Well, that's a good point. I think there is the two parts: the accommodation, the legal human rights, and the medical / religious, and then there's the actual real world accommodation. Israel, one of the things that I think is designed, and I think you all know, our chamber and the Cambridge Chamber have really been, working long and hard of getting medical grade masks and rapid screening and disinfectant wipes, and having an ambassador program of people going out, all because those are tools that can help business open and stay open in the middle of this pandemic. But I think about the vax verification scheme that's in place, and before it ever started, you have some in government saying, "Hey, look, this isn't going to be for forever. We don't want to have the state in knowing everything you're doing." But I think is that not a version of what the government is trying to do to incent or coerce? I forget what the term you used, Matt, was saying, "Hey, yeah, you don't have to get vaccinated, but you also don't get to go to a restaurant unless you do get vaccinated, right? There's things you won't be able to do. You don't get to go to the Raptors game, the Leafs game, the Kitchener Rangers game, or a restaurant unless you're double vaxxed." And is that, I guess I'm just kind of, as it relates to the small businesses that are watching here today, putting something in place is really for the bulk of your organization. And Matt's talked about it as, the exceptions to the rule, there's always one, as much as you might not like to think there is.
So I like the distinction that you drew, Ian, earlier about the legal accommodation, and then there's the real world accommodation, right? Legally, you're quite right. I don't think there is any concern from the Human Rights Code perspective, or occupational health and safety, or employment standards. The prevailing sentiment among government bodies, whether it's right or wrong is immaterial, is that everybody's got to vaccinate. There are no exceptions. Even if you claim a religious exemption, and I've yet to hear of a legitimate one from any mainstream or smaller religion, it's going to be defeated by the argument that, well, it's going to cause us undue hardship if we have to accommodate you. And the College of Physicians is basically telling doctors, look, you don't have a right to issue an exemption for anybody. I mean, and doctors have gotten the message. So we're not going to, I don't think we're going to face that problem. I think we're going to face a real life problem of how do you incentivize an employee to get vaccinated, and how do you make the rest of your staff comfortable? And the method of social ostracism that Matt was talking about works. It's not based on safety. It's based on creating incentives for people to get vaccinated. Because if you can't go to a restaurant, and you can't go to a game, and you won't be able to board a plane, then you're very limited. You're hemmed in terms of your activities.
Yeah, so, principals take a back seat when you can't get on a plane to go to Florida in March. Right. So.
Or if you don't get your bonus, you don't get a Christmas bonus. You tell people, look, you know what? You don't want to follow the rules. That's fine. You're not coming to the Christmas party, and you're not going to be incented. Now, what's interesting, Ian, I think Matt's got a case of an individual who claims that she was, one of her complaints, she went to the Human Rights Tribunal. She said, oh my gosh, they didn't invite me to the Christmas party because I'd been on sick leave. But no one's going to be able to complain about that, because the Human Rights Tribunal isn't going to entertain that complaint, and neither will the Employment Standards Branch. So you can pretty much do whatever you like. And
Yeah.
if you terminate somebody, if you choose to terminate them, I think the courts are going to be unsympathetic to the employee.
Yeah, and I guess that's part of it is I mean, and this is the real world issues that employers face and grapple with, which is, you know, how important, to Matt's point, they're a superstar, can't afford to lose them, but they're not following the rules. How do you incent or coerce, whatever the term was you used? So, I mean, we'll come back to that, because I think there's a couple other things that follow it in an additional question. But I wanted to go to the COVID safety plans with Michael. Because this is, vaccines aren't the only piece. We are saying it's belt and suspenders time at the chambers of commerce of saying important now that we've reopened after the third wave and now into a fourth wave, and we've reopened, and saying, how do we open and stay open? Well, it's belt and suspenders time. It's all the social public health measures, social distance, mask, you know, capacity restrictions, signage, but also rapid screening process. Maybe talk through that, Michael, when you're talking with your small business clients of saying, and there is resources out there, the ambassador program that the Regional Waterloo and our chambers, the two chambers, have been advocating. And so there's actual free resources to help them understand what they should do in their workplace. But employers have those real life concerns about both the practical part of running their business, but also making sure they're not only meeting, but in many cases, they want to exceed the public health guidelines and to your point, Jason, you know, saying my most important resource is my staff and to make sure my clients can come in the door. So what do I do to make sure that's happening? And that's usually exceeding what the minimum standards are. Michael, give us a sense of what your clients are talking about.
Well, I know at the very start of the pandemic, the idea of a safety plan was kind of new, a COVID safety plan. I mean, there are several policies, but the regulations prescribed employers that were permitted to open to have a COVID safety plan. And so those were things that I was drafting from scratch. And, you know, it had to be tailored very specifically to the workplace. And so, you know, that was quite the process, because you needed to know, okay, which rooms are common rooms? What kind of barriers are at play? And you really want to look at it as if you're an inspector, because that's the first thing that any health and safety inspector is going to ask for if they're coming in and looking at workplaces. And so, so that was important at that point in time. What we noticed, and what I'm sure everyone watching this knows, is that, you know, the changes happened, you know, it seemed like every day or every week, and they were different with different sectors and different employers. And so, you know, staying up to date and knowing what your particular sector needed to do was really important. What the minister, or what the government of Ontario did, which is really great, is that it created this safety plan builder online. And so, although we all have this obligation to create a safety plan, and it might seem like an onerous thing to do to make sure that you're constantly complying with the ever-changing you know, COVID environment, businesses can effectively create their own tailored plan for free online. And so I would recommend all employers to check that out and to engage with that, just so that they can, you know, anticipate and make sure that they have procedures in place for, you know, if there's any inspector that were to come inside. And it also helps address, you know, what will happen if certain issues arise in the workplace. You know, if any COVID-related issues arise, you have an opportunity to know, you know, who maybe the point of contact is and what procedures might follow. So I think clarifying that and kind of giving, you know, comfort to those who are reporting to the workplace is really important. And with the resources that are now available, it's more important than ever for employers to use them.
So Jason, I want to come back to you, and others can chime in if depending on who's got the expertise here. One of the things that came up was we were developing the rapid screening program, which we were the first in the province. In fact, we were the first in the country to roll that out, for rapid screening being made available free of charge to employers to do in their workplace. One of the challenges which was dealt with was it had to be a medical professional that administered the test. We discovered that a well-trained basset hound could do that test and get a result. So we took that off the table. But what was interesting is, again, and this is part of it. So as part of the plan Michael just talked about, having those available in your workplace and saying we are encouraging, or because I'm not sure you can demand an employee actually take the test. It could be a condition of coming into the building, but you make them available, let them self-administer the rapid screening kit or screening kit. I guess the question that comes is, when they're self-screening, in theory, you're not supposed to know, and they don't have under no obligation to tell you what the result was, whether it was positive or negative. So it leads to the duty to notify either, certainly in this case, the employer, if you do test positive, either with a screening or you're in close contact. How should businesses be thinking about that and articulating what their own expectation? Because Israel's raised a couple of points of saying what your expectation of employer is of your staff. Yet that's at least a starting point of saying, here's what our expectations are. Some of it will be legal in nature. Some of it will be the business practice. How do you kind of walk a business through that part? Because it's really important to know if someone, even if they're vaccinated, has a breakthrough case, because it can affect and shut down your whole operation.
Absolutely. Well, and I think that this is one of the things that COVID has taken traditional wisdom in a certain sense and turned it on its head, because as employers, as business owners, we're all so used to the idea that, look, if it's personal medical information, hands off. Like we are entitled to know only the barest, scint of information when it comes to stuff. We don't have a prerogative to ask questions. But you look at the whole concept of a vaccine passport, it's basically we've got employers, we've got business owners who are operating the same way that doormen operate at the bar. They're checking IDs on the way. They're going to know whether you're vaxxed or not vaxxed. From a privacy perspective, you ought not to be holding on to that information unless, as part of your policy, you say to people, hey, if you're prepared to confirm with us on writing, and it's your choice, but we'll keep a record of who's vaxxed and who's not. That way we don't have to ask you every time you pass through the doorway. That's fine. On the piece about the rapid test, I think that this is where employers absolutely are entitled to know the result. You are entitled to know whether it is, because otherwise, what's the point? You're entitled to know whether the person tests positive or tests negative. And the positive outcome is a precondition to being able to walk through the door. If there's a negative outcome, or rather, sorry, I'm confusing my positives and negatives. But if there's the outcome we want, that is to say, the negative screening result, but the positive outcome.
You want to test negative. You don't want to test
come on
positive.
In. But if you test negative, or rather, if you test
negative,
if you test as having COVID, then you're not passing the turnstile. And that information. Employers are not entitled to. They're never entitled to details as to an employee's underlying pathology, medical conditions, their history, the treatments, the drugs they're taking, none of that. But employers are entitled always to ask questions that go to the employee's functional abilities, their ability to do their job, their ability and eligibility.
I think one of the things that people, and it's a good point, is there are restrictions if you're a truck driver to have, certain tests done. And if you're traveling internationally on behalf of your company, you have to be, have certain shots and booster shots, et cetera. So COVID is just the most obvious one. And it's one that everyone's dealing with now, as opposed to being a more narrow slice. But your point about as we talk about you screen positive or you have a full blown case, the duty to accommodate is different in that circumstance, because that would presume you don't want them in the workplace if they're sick to begin with. And they should be following the public health public health direction, because there's responsibilities for individual citizens around that as well. Maybe talk about that duty to accommodate. And there's two ways of looking at this. One is, if you if you test positive and with a screening kit or a PCR test, you know, and they got to be home. That's where you want them. That's their obligation. And then there's the duty to accommodate, which I think we've already touched on. But I think in this context, it's important for people to know people will still screen positive for COVID-19 for an extended period of time, like for months and months and months. And so it's important to have that policy in place, which Israel has pointed out is, you know, you better have your own business policy in place. What are your clients thinking about that duty to accommodate in a vaccinated COVID world? Yeah,
Or what? Well, that's a good question because we're not there yet, and I think that you want to just to not quite answer your question, but I promise I will. Which is everything we're saying today is how it is today. But had you asked us a lot of these questions 3 weeks ago, and the answers might have been slightly different. I've noted, you know, jokingly that it's often like going back to law school because everything seems to be changing. It started with the CERB benefit and the workplace top ups and stuff, and it changed about every 2 weeks. It seemed like we had to relearn this stuff. So anyway, with that in mind, looking a little bit forward to fully COVID vaccinated world, what about accommodation? Well, at that point, I think then it's going to switch back to more of a legal definition of accommodation, which is to say if somebody is sick and needs to go home for a few days to recover, or if there is a family status issue, for instance, their husband or their mother or their child has contracted the virus or anything for that matter, and there needs to be care. I mean, there's that legal duty pops up again because it's this, you understand the distinction between, you know, the human rights accommodation for someone who is claiming that they don't need to get it versus somebody who has the virus and needs to recover at home, or again, family status issues and what have you. So I think that once we get to that point, it is to say nothing of I know one of the ESA, there's also a right to recoup. I think it's $200 a day. Is that right, Israel? Isn't it?
Yeah, 3 days.
Yeah, up to 3 days.
3 days.
So all of the old school, if you will, law and the old school accommodation and all of the old school responsibilities that are upon employers pre-COVID, I think will come back into play in that sense.
Okay, let's move on. And because this is going to be part of our world for an extended period of time. Is your office working? I notice you're all in different places, so I presume that you're either some may be in the office, but some will be at home. That's probably going to be the par for the course. There's some form of hybrid for many businesses. Obviously not for frontline, but for many businesses. Our chamber, as an example, is still fully remote. We probably won't come back in person until many of the public health guidelines are lifted, so we can get back to doing events. But others are already kind of saying, how do they ease back into it? And so maybe I'll start with Israel, maybe for some overarching kind of thoughts on that. That's something for the small business owner saying, well, how do I manage that? What are the things I should be thinking about as I go and say, how and who needs to be in the office? What are the days that people are going to be in? I mean, there's all kinds of permutations and combinations that people are looking at. How should people kind of look at, our small businesses look at that issue of how to reopen and how much to reopen, and that hybrid model of some people working at home? How do you kind of square all that together or piece all that together?
I'm just going to interrupt and just point out that both Israel and Michael and I are actually in the office, but the lazy guy, Jason in the corner, he's trying to make it look like he's at the office with that blurry bookcase, but I know he's at home. I just want
he's the only one that looks like he's in an office.
I know.
That's actually a phony backdrop. I'm at the beach, as a matter of fact. And I mean, and therein, and not to do an aside, but I mean, therein lies a whole other set of issues where there's a question of, are employees where they say they are, and how accessible are they? Because you can work remotely from just about anywhere these days.
Yeah. That's true. Israel, get us started on this one.
So I'm going to start, you raise a good point, and that'll lead into the question that you raise, Ian. And we go back to baseline principles. And that is, the employer has the right to determine where work is going to be performed. It's your business. It's your work. You've got to turn a profit. So you decide what makes the most sense for you. Now, you have all that authority, but at the same time, you got to think, all right, what are people comfortable with? Am I going to achieve the same level of productivity that I had pre-pandemic by bringing everyone together when people are rubbing elbows and they may not be entirely comfortable about working together in an office? But ultimately, the model that you adopt based on the definition of your interest is what will govern, and the courts will respect at the end of the day. Now, there are fear mongers out in the press who are trying to say, oh no, if you don't bring people back to work, then it's going to become a term of their contract of employment that they can work remotely. That's nonsense. The reason people are working from home is because of public health measures. In fact, the government still encourages people to work from home, right? They do. So compliance with public health directives doesn't turn it into a term in the contract of employment. So what I would say to your members who are worried about, oh no, they're going to stay at home too long as public health is recommending it, it almost has the weight of law.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
That's the, so we need to put things in perspective. Touching on what Jason said, there are all kinds of issues if an employee decides to move to Hawaii and start work from there. What are they? Well, there's the issue of insurance coverages. If you have a group benefit policy and an employee effectively changes their residence, to what extent is the group benefits applicable to them? If you have insurances, right? Errors and omissions insurance for people who are working in professional situations. If the work is performed abroad, is there coverage for it?
Mm-hmm.
Right? So it's not a simple matter of, well, hey, the quality of the work is the same. It isn't necessarily the same. From the perspective of our firm, Matt observed that everybody, other than Jason, who's at a beach in Florida, or was it Jamaica the last time I can't remember, can't keep track of all of your travels. There's a value in our firm for people working together.
Yeah.
People learn from each other. They're able to draw on each other's experience in a way that can't be mimicked on Zoom. We're having this wonderful discussion, but there's nothing like being together around the table.
Well,
Okay.
And we're social creatures too, right? I mean, that is what, quite apart from the imperative to get work done. I mean, that like the lack of in-person has impacted business. It's impacted people's mental health. It's just impacted the sense of morale and camaraderie that, we're lucky enough to have in our workplace when we're all in the same place and I'm not on a beach somewhere. Like that is just as much a driving practical force in this as anything else is. There are so many good reasons why we should be looking to get back to something that looks like normal at the first practical opportunity.
So let's all head down to McCabe's, man. Now that's a good thing. We'll all meet together down at McCabe's.
Well, you know what? It actually leads to, because we've got about another 10 minutes and I still got a couple of questions to get to, but it does lead to, and I'll maybe direct this at Michael and then maybe Matt, the value of remote work agreements. So to Israel's point, it doesn't have it has a weight in law that you can make that accommodation during a public health, but it probably behooves businesses to start to sketch out what that working from home or that remote work policy starts to look like, because it will moderate, because once public health measures are lifted, then I think you do have to make a choice of where you expect people to be and when you expect them to be there. So is there, I guess maybe that's the first part, Matt, is there, or Michael, is there value in starting to draft or create a remote work agreement with your employees who are at home right now that can be edited and to reflect the changing public health measures and directives that Jason's talked about and Matt have talked about?
Absolutely, Ian. I think one of the really important aspects that Israel touched upon is clarifying when and in which circumstances you want to assert control over where work is performed. And it might not be simply at the office, but you might not want someone like Jason traveling to Hawaii and working from the beach. You might want to have your workers within a particular jurisdiction. And why that's important is because the application of certain laws, for instance, employment standards legislation, like the Employment Standards Act in Ontario, the application of that is determinant on where work is performed. So, for instance, if someone is performing work in British Columbia or out east in Nova Scotia, the application of, and they're a provincially regulated employee, the laws that actually apply to the employment relationship can change. Depending on how long someone is working in a particular area. And that's just provincially. What if someone's working in a different country? That has implications when it comes to employment insurance and when it comes to overtime pay.
And tax. You don't want a tax footprint in a
permanent
foreign jurisdiction
establishments, yeah,
by accident.
At which point is a permanent establishment created in a different country? There are tax implications as well. And so
you guys promised we weren't going into constitutional law and federal provincial jurisdiction here. So, but I think the point is well taken that Jason, you've all touched on, is where you're doing the work from matters. How, it's one thing if you're on vacation and a temporary, if it's more of a permanent situation, those are things that your insurer and your legal counsel and your accountant and others should be aware of. But it all comes back to that. These are the types of questions that I don't think you would have necessarily been asking in the same way outside of COVID, because no one really thought about this except for everyone's doing it now. And I think that's part of this measure is assume nothing, because that makes an ass out of you and me. So I think that the point of this, of having that remote work agreement is, and having your legal counsel or your accountant or others who can say, okay, well, here's the questions you need to ask when you're putting that together, is really important. Matt, again, a little bit around the value of those work agreements. What are your clients? Are they doing that yet, or how are they kind of addressing the fact that? And here's the other part of this, which is COVID related. It ties to what we just talked about. Talent is one of the biggest issues that most of your clients, certainly it's the number one thing I hear about. People cannot hire the people they need to grow their business. And so they kind of feel as though one of the, I won't say benefits, but if there is positives that have come out of COVID, is hiring for people from further afield than the region of Waterloo, or having someone move to be around an office is a benefit, but it also has some implications, and so that's the follow on here. How does your worldview change for a small business because of COVID?
Well, that's an interesting question. I mean that's going to be customized to each small business, I suppose. I think that I echo Israel's comment about workplace culture, i.e. being together, like being in the same spot, and the value of that, and the mentoring and just collegiality and maybe workplace cohesion that you can get from that. So when you start hiring far afield, I mean, there's no doubt that's where a lot of the workplace is going in terms of that. I mean, you find top talent and he or she is in Thunder Bay, and they can zoom in when necessary. Otherwise, they do their work. I think that's going to be a personal customized choice for each individual business. I know that touching on it about the return to work and working from home. A lot of my clients are doing, they are desperate to get people back in there, not just because they're paying rent, but because of this collegiality in this workplace family type environment. And they're doing rolling, slowly but surely, but rolling attendance things. So you could, A through D come in Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and the other half come in on those days. And then it switches, and then they switch again, and just trying to get people in. And I think there's a value to that as well, not only from a workplace culture point of view, but to ease employees and ease their fears, to go all the way back to the beginning here of our chat about people's hesitancy to maybe return to work if not everyone's vaxxed. That helps smooth the transition back into work.
Well, leave it to 5 lawyers and a preacher's kid to, 4 lawyers and a preacher's kid. There's a joke there somewhere that we almost run out the clock here. So, but I have 2 quick questions. We're going to do a lightning round here, and I'll maybe direct one to, I think it could be more, I'll take your pick. Someone can dive in here. But on the chat box, there's a series of questions, but I think one that kind of wraps up a number of the issues around having a plan, having agreements, what happens if, is the legal ramifications or the issues that arise from 2 scenarios. One is when you require employees to take that rapid screening test on 2 or 3 times a week. And then if the employee is let go for refusing to get vaccinated. So that's 2 of the same. You can, saying one of the obligations is to test to come into the facility, but they won't do that. What are the tools that you can use? Or if you say vaccines is something that everyone's required to have as a condition of employment, and they don't do that. And I think I heard you say this earlier, Jason, or maybe it was Israel, that if that's something you're putting in place right now, yes, you'll have the more towards the minimum ESA obligations if you're letting someone go for cause, but you're able to do it. It's not like this is an egregious situation because you're making that a condition of employment. So I don't know, maybe Israel or Jason want to handle that, and then I got one more question. We're going to have to wrap up.
Well, I'll just jump in and I'll say that as the employer, you have a right to expect employees to adhere to the protocol. So if the safety protocol is you've got to be tested before you enter the facility, particularly if you choose not to be vaccinated, and the employee refuses, then the employer can apply the normal disciplinary measures that it would use for any infraction of the rules. And you just steadily, you remind them, you might suspend them, and then you give them the final warning. And and they will enjoy little sympathy from any tribunal.
So it's normal course of what is nothing particularly special. In fact, it may be more employer friendly in the context of COVID. Okay, last question. The last question, I'm going to direct this to Jason, and then we're going to wrap up. And just to put a point in this, I think there is, and I'm what I hear, read, what I talk about. If you're hiring new employees now, in during COVID, right at this moment in time, and insist as part of the condition of employment that you be vaccinated, that's entirely permissible because it's a choice that both you as the employer can make and the employee. So there, it becomes, there's no debate about that after the fact. If you write that into an offer of employment. Should that be a new standard for employers moving forward?
A lot of my clients are doing exactly that. And, I won't say that it's absolutely permissible because there is that sliver of opportunity, which is to say, subject to accommodation for bona fide medical circumstances. And that's where you get into the alternate measures of rapid testing 2-3 times a week or what have you. But absolutely. I think that a lot of employers, there are a couple of takeaways really from COVID and for employers bringing on new staff. And that's definitely one of them. Employers are saying, we don't want to have to get into an arm wrestling match with people after the fact once they're in. This is a clear priority. We're going to set it up front. The other thing that employers are starting to introduce that we didn't used to see before is the introduction of a provision in an offer letter that says we reserve the right to temporarily lay you off. Because before COVID, the concept of a temporary layoff in a non-unionized environment was almost unheard of. People are learning their lessons, and they're saying, maybe there'll be other circumstances where we would need to do this. So we're going to start including that in our offers too.
Don't say that. One pandemic in a lifetime is plenty for us. Let's get through this one. But always good. Listen, gang, thank you so much to all of you, to Matt and Michael, Jason and Israel, and the folks, good folks at Duntroon Law for making time and for joining us today. Great session. A special thank you once again to our title sponsor for the series, Manulife, our platinum sponsor for the series, our good friends at the Immigration Partnership of Waterloo Region, and again to our October sponsors, our friends at Duntroon Law. And finally, to all of you for joining us today. As a reminder, we do host a new Business Success Series session every Wednesday at 1 p.m. Next week, we'll be joined by Michelle Eaton. She's the Vice President of Public Affairs with the Ontario Chamber of Commerce. And my good friend and colleague, Minto Snyder. She's the CEO of Explore Waterloo Region. We'll be discussing the latest on the vaccine verification app, rollout, and what that means for businesses. We hope to see you then. For full details and to register, please go to greaterkwchamber.com. Please do share this series with your friends and colleagues, and join us every Wednesday afternoon for another edition of the Business Success Series. Because if it's Wednesday, it is the Business Success Series. Thanks so much, Fang. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good job, guys.